From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Pro-Palestinian protesters barricade themselves on the campus of Columbia University, escalating tensions with administrators who are now threatening expulsion. We'll have a live report from Upper Manhattan.
Republicans in Congress take steps they say will protect Jewish students on campus as House Democrats vow to save Speaker Mike Johnson's job if Republican hardliners try to oust him.
And former President Trump held in contempt of court, fined $9,000 for violating a gag order in his criminal trial in New York, where the judge is now threatening jail time. We'll speak with former federal prosecutor Michael Zeldin. Busy day today, Kaylee, as we join our listeners and viewers here for the late edition of Balance of Power. Things have been intensifying throughout the day here on the campus of Columbia.
Yeah, certainly a lot happening in Upper Manhattan. After yesterday, students were threatened with suspension. Today, it is now expulsion. And it's no longer just that central area we're talking about. They have barricaded themselves inside Hamilton Hall.
That's absolutely right. And we're going to begin this evening with protests roiling campuses all over the country, specifically at Columbia. Dozens of protesters took over a building early this morning, just after midnight, barring entrances and unfurling a Palestinian flag from a window in that building. The administration threatening students now with expulsion. And Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu is just outside Columbia University's campus in Upper Manhattan, where you can hear the protesters chanting behind her this evening. Things, Scarlett, really seem to come to life this afternoon. What's going on there?
Yeah, it was a very quiet morning, Kaylee and Joe, and things really got lively in the past hour and a half with students protesting. They're inside the gates of Columbia University, and I say that because the campus is off limits to anyone who is not a student who lives on campus. So the protest is taking place inside the gates. There's also a group of people gathered outside the gates of the university. They're chanting Free Palestine. There are drums, there are tambourines, there are bullhorns. They're waving Palestinian flags. They're wearing the keffiyeh, the headscarf. They're also wearing sunglasses and masks to protect their identity. And this is all happening, of course, as the university has made clear that those students who stay occupied in Hamilton Hall face expulsion from the Ivy League school. Ben Chang, who is a spokesperson for Columbia University, says protesters have chosen to escalate to an untenable situation. In addition to expulsion for those students who are inside Hamilton Hall, those who do not leave the encampment area are now being suspended. Seniors will not be able to graduate. Having said that, the school is moving forward with graduation ceremonies scheduled for May 15th. We walked by the gates of the campus, and there's still signs saying that they're preparing for that event to take place. The goal, of course, is to avoid what happened at the University of Southern California, where they had to cancel the commencement exercises because of the protests and the fears that students would be unsafe.
Well, Scarlett, I'm glad you brought up USC because it does really kind of raise the issue that this is not just happening at Columbia University. It is not unique to just this one campus. How does what's happening where you are compare to what we're seeing at other Ivy League schools or other schools across the country?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's heavy police presence here outside Columbia University. We've seen police trucks drive by with metal barricades. They're erecting more and more of these to kind of keep the pedestrians separate from the protesters. Having said that, there's been no violent confrontation. There's been no arrests that we've seen. And the few NYPD that I've talked to have said that they've just been standing by monitoring. They won't enter campus unless they're called in. And of course, that stands in contrast to some of the protests taking place in other parts of the country. Elsewhere, in another Ivy League school, Brown University has made clear that it has struck an agreement with some of the student protesters. In exchange for the student protesters leaving their encampment, the university has invited some of them to go speak to the Brown Corporation and to discuss their presentation for divestment, and they will be holding a vote on that. So it's not clear if that's something that Columbia University students would be satisfied with, as they are pushing for not just disclosure and divestment, but also amnesty for the students who face expulsion as well as suspension because of their activities.
All right, Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu outside the gates of Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Speaker Mike Johnson held a news conference earlier today about what is happening across these college campuses and what he'd like Congress to do about it. Take a listen.
We will not allow anti-Semitism to thrive on campus, and we will hold these universities accountable for their failure to protect Jewish students on campus. And that's why today we're here to announce a house-wide effort to crack down on anti-Semitism on college campuses. The federal government plays a critical role in higher education, and we will use all the tools available to us.
Let's go now to Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. So, Wendy, obviously there are some areas in which we do see bipartisan agreement. Is this one of them where we actually are going to see the federal government actually getting something accomplished, making a difference here?
With the campus protests, I doubt it, given the difference between the statements we heard from the White House and from Mike Johnson today. The White House put out a statement that was pretty much, work within the rules, kids, be careful.
I think we're having a little trouble with your mic, Wendy, while we're trying to understand that. It's important to note here, Kaylee, that we do have members of both parties from both sides of the aisle in the House of Representatives who've actually made their way to Columbia's campus. We've not seen a bipartisan gathering on that campus, and they've both been calling for different things, with Democrats having their say early on, and Republicans actually calling the speaker himself for the resignation of the president of Columbia. I wonder if they start to bring themselves together on this issue.
Yeah, it's a very valid question. Of course, to your point, we saw 4 Democratic Jewish members of the House of Representatives first going. Then Mike Johnson held that news conference with essentially the entire Republican New York delegation behind him. Many of those New York members in particular, like Mike Lawler or Nicole Malliotakis, have been particularly vocal on this issue. But it does kind of raise the point of how politically fraught this issue is, especially if Republicans see this as a way that they can kind of paint a picture of Democrats who are struggling with unification of the party, as it was so difficult for Republicans to do over an issue like Israel, or Ukraine, rather. The issue of Israel, perhaps, is the divisive one that Democrats are contending with, and it's an opportunity for Republicans to paint it as such.
Yeah, we'll have a lot more, obviously, to talk about on this, and it's something we just wanted to make sure that we had covered for you here following that development today. Suspension becomes expulsion in the eyes of the Columbia administration. Let's turn now to New York State Supreme Court, where Donald Trump was again watching witness testimony against him today. Back in court today, hearing from lawyers for Karen McDougal. Trump was also slapped with a contempt of court charge for social media posts he's made over the past month. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Mario Parker for more on this. $9,000 is the fine for the billionaire. The judge seemed frustrated today that he couldn't do more to silence Donald Trump with repeated violations of a gag order. He threatened jail time, or I believe incarceratory punishment is how he put it. We're not serious about a former president in jail, are we?
I mean, the logistical issues that would cause right there in New York is one thing. I mean, that would be a challenge I'm not sure that Justice Marchand would want to take on. But what we did see here is essentially Donald Trump has been, as he's wont to do, trying to call the bluff of the apparatus, right? He's known to try to bully witnesses, those who go against him as well. Consequences kind of be darned. Yeah. And right here we see essentially that the justice is saying, $9,000, as you put it, Joe, to a billionaire is maybe a drop in the bucket, but it's also a way for the justice to signal that he's not going to allow Trump to call his bluff.
I guess we'll wait and see. We're going to hear more on this on Thursday. And question as to whether or not there have been more counts of violating this gag order. In the meantime, though, Trump does have a day off in court, outside of court tomorrow. He's going to be visiting some pretty important swing states, Michigan and Wisconsin, not missing the one weekday opportunity, I guess, Mario, he has to campaign.
Yes, and he has to get out there, right? I mean, think about it. The former president, for the better part of the last couple of weeks, particularly today, has had to deal with salacious details about his personal life and the lengths that he had to go in order to keep them secret. While we haven't necessarily seen that hit show up in polls just yet, it has to be damaging to his campaign for this to continue. So, yes, we're seeing him go shore up relations in a place in the Midwest, right? In Michigan, Wisconsin, Waukesha, those places where he'll need to win in November.
I want to just circle back, Mario, to where we started this hour with the protests on campus at Columbia and, of course, a very concerted debate here that involves Republicans and Democrats. But on the presidential campaign trail, Joe Biden has really been feeling the criticism. They're trying to work on messaging in his campaign, as I'm sure you can speak to. Where does Donald Trump come down on this, and will we start hearing more from his campaign?
Well, Donald Trump right now, right, if your opponent, he's a political, listen, he was a reality star that made his way to the White House. He knows politics. He knows people. If you see your opponent struggling with an issue,
you just let
either
him go.
You amplify it or you let it go,
Yeah.
right? Right now, Joe Biden is being boxed in. This is the second issue that he's being boxed in within his party in an election year, right? The other issue was immigration, where he was having issues with the left flank of his party. Right. Here's another one, and you're seeing him really deal with this existential crisis, both geopolitical and domestic.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Bloomberg's Mario Parker, thank you so much. We do want to go back now to Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who was speaking to this idea that you're seeing a lot of fracturing, perhaps, or discord in how exactly campus protests should be handled. But we've seen a lot of fracturing, as I was mentioning, not just within the Democratic Party over this issue, but the Republican Party over other issues, which has led some like Marjorie Taylor Greene to say, I want the speaker out. We did hear, though, from Democrats today, Wendy, who said if she tries, they will table the motion. They will vote to protect him.
Exactly right. The Democrats this time seem to be indicating that they have had enough with the Marjorie Taylor Greene's camp-led chaos in the House. They did not vote to help Kevin McCarthy when he was ousted at all. It was every Democrat and a few Republicans enough to oust him. This time, the Democrats are saying, Mike Johnson worked with us. He did some, we got these bipartisan bills passed, including aid to Israel, aid to Ukraine, aid to Taiwan. And therefore, this time, we will save him. They added, they will save him this time. That if Marjorie Taylor Greene persists in this quest to oust him, which very few Republicans, even in her own Freedom Caucus, want to see happen, that's it. Mike Johnson's on his own if it keeps going after this one time.
Marjorie Taylor Greene writes on X, I'm a big believer in recorded votes. So we're going to go through this one way or the other so she can get everybody on record.
I think she wants everybody to get on record for it, even though, and then who knows what she's going to do with that information.
Right.
But, even former President Trump doesn't want her to pursue in this. It just isn't good branding, as Mario was talking about with Trump's, marketing ability. It's not good branding for the Republicans to keep doing this time after time after time, especially when Mike Johnson got something done.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll take a deeper look at the war between Israel and Hamas and the ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire with former U.S. Ambassador to Morocco, Mark Ginsburg. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Thanks for being with us as we turn to tomorrow's Fed meeting. Regulators are expected to leave rates unchanged. Joining us now is Anna Wong, Bloomberg Economics Chief U.S. Economist. Anna, it's great to see you as we wait for a meeting that will have no rate change. What about the statement and the language we hear from the chair in the news conference?
So we will be watching closely any subtle changes in the statement. So previously in the statement, there's a phrase that described inflation as having eased, even though it remains elevated. We think that they're going to delete that phrase about inflation having eased, but just simply say that inflation remains elevated. So even though that's a very subtle and tiny changes from a layman's eyes, it's actually a big shift. It basically suggests that there's been a rethink within the FOMC, and that they probably think that the progress of disinflation has stalled.
Well, and I would imagine, Anna, that a hot employment cost index today only might reinforce that argument. But it's worth keeping in mind that market expectations for Fed policy for the remainder of this year already have shifted substantially since the last meeting. Is it still possible that we could see even further hawkish surprise from Chairman Powell tomorrow?
So my team has examined monetary policy surprises very closely, and what I noticed is that there has not been a big market repricing that the Fed itself has not participated in. And if you look at the sharp run up in Treasury yields just in the past month, Powell has barely shifted his tone. So tomorrow we do need to see Powell to shift his tone to a into a more hawkish manner. So yeah, Kayleigh, I do think that there's still more hawkishness in Powell's words, and I think that the market could see further repricing.
So if you were in that news conference tomorrow, Anna, and you were asking a question of the hawk, what would it be?
I would ask Powell whether a rate hike could be on the table for this year, and how a November election would change the calculus. If in November the economy does require the Fed to cut, would they cut?
All right, that's an excellent question. I guess we'll see whether or not he gets asked some version of that tomorrow. And it also kind of bears keeping in mind that it is a dual mandate that the Fed is thinking about here. On the one hand, yes, they are trying to achieve that 2% inflation target. On the other hand, they do want full employment, which means they have to pay attention to what's happening in the labor market and just in the economy overall in terms of its stability. When you see things like consumer confidence, which has been what has been holding up better than UMich consumer sentiment, these are the Conference Board numbers, dropping to the lowest level since mid-2022. Do you see reason that the Fed might have to be concerned that things are starting to turn in a more material way, just as inflation is proving to be sticky? Yes. What do they pick in that scenario?
Yes. So we have a way of tracking these employment surprises versus inflation surprises systematically. So our tracker shows that growth has consistently surprised on the downside in the last 3 months, whereas inflation is surprised on the strong side. And the weakness in the depiction of the labor market in the consumer survey today is consistent with a lot of the softer surveys in the past 3 months that shows the labor market is cooling. However, this Friday, we're going to get the non-farm payroll report for April, and it likely is going to show the monthly gains in hiring tops 200,000, which is not a weak number. And I think the market and also the Fed will take more signal from the strong non-farm payroll hiring this Friday rather than from the signal from the consumer confidence survey.
All right, Anna, thank you. Anna Wong, Bloomberg Economics, with us this day before the Fed decision. Thanks for joining us on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. If you or I were in that position, if we had violated the gag order to that extent, what would happen to us?
I think we'd go to jail. No question about it. And
so then
Trump,
obviously then the law does not apply equally already. We've established that.
I think we've seen, as we saw in the immunity argument in the Supreme Court, Trump has gotten a deference from the courts unlike anyone else.
Part of our conversation with Jim Zirin, the former assistant attorney for the Southern District of New York, talking about the unusual consequences of violating a gag order, certainly in the case of Donald Trump. Former federal prosecutor Michael Zeldin joins us now with more. Michael, we got word on the gag order today. It's a $9,000 fine for the billionaire, the former president of the United States. And the judge seemed frustrated without being able to do more, and in fact invoked the possibility of jail time. He threatened incarceratory punishment as part of his statement. Nobody believes that that could happen, do they?
I don't think so. Although if Donald Trump continues to violate the terms of the gag order, it's foreseeable that the judge could lose his patience and do something like that, step him back, as they say, for an hour or two behind the courtroom in the little holding cell that they have there. I don't expect that. And actually, we saw today Trump did tweet something, or social media portrays the judge as prejudiced and blah, 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 blah. But he steered clear of anything that the gag order prohibited. So maybe he will stay within the confines of it. And, hopefully he does for his sake.
Well, Michael, it kind of begs the question of even if from now on he does stay within the confines of the gag order, he already has made it known that he thinks Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen are sleazebags and a variety of other things. His opinions are out there. People who follow and support Donald Trump already know them. That can't be reversed. I just wonder how much further violations would even matter when all of that already has happened.
I don't think it would matter at all, which is sort of the irony of the gag order. And in fact, curiously, in today's gag order hearing, the judge said, look, to Trump, if Cohen and Daniels come after you in social media, you can reply in kind. So he said that Cohen is using the gag order as a sword, and he's not going to allow Cohen to use it and deny Trump the right to reply. So you've got a lot of sort of adolescent behavior here among Trump, Daniels, and Cohen. Behoove each of them to just sort of be quiet and let the day in court be their, sort of megaphone. But I don't think any of them have the resistance to do that.
Yeah, we heard from the former president as he was leaving the courthouse earlier. This has become a daily event. Michael, let's listen to what he said.
Okay, thank you very much. This gag order is not only unique, it's totally unconstitutional. I'm the Republican candidate for President of the United States. I received this honor in record time. Nobody's ever gone faster. It's never happened. Nobody's ever got the numbers that we got. And I'm sitting in a courthouse all day long listening to this stuff.
He continues to frame this as Joe Biden weaponizing the Justice Department. Michael Zeldin, you worked for the Justice Department. Can you delineate for us?
Yeah, there's something called the federal system and the state system. Joe Biden is in charge of the federal system. And in New York, Alvin Bragg is the chief law enforcement officer for the state system. And they can coordinate. There are state federal prosecutions that I participated in and many people participated in. But there's no evidence here of a Biden-led Justice Department prosecution. If the Justice Department wanted to prosecute, they would have done so through the Southern District of New York. They had the authority to prosecute these exact same charges. They declined. So in some sense, the Biden Justice Department has declined to proceed, and the state Justice Department, through Alvin Bragg, has decided to proceed separately.
Okay, so fact check from Michael Zeldin, understood. There also, in terms of what we've been hearing consistently from Donald Trump, is this idea that this gag order prevents him from responding to ways in which he has been attacked. We were speaking with another attorney, Robert McWhorter, on the early edition of Balance of Power today, who essentially was describing that if Donald Trump wants the ability to speak freely, he can do so from the witness stand. Is testifying in his own defense really his safe, legal, non-violating of any court order opportunity to air all of his grievances with these witnesses?
Well, testifying certainly would not violate the gag order unless he says something crazy on the witness stand. Whether it's safe is a whole other question. I don't think from a legal jeopardy standpoint, it would be smart to put Donald Trump on the witness stand, because I don't think that he would make a very good witness. I would think he would make Michael Cohen look like an ideal witness. But as the evidence comes in, if Trump's lawyer believes that they need a Hail Mary pass and Trump is that, they may put him on the witness stand, but I don't expect to see him. I just think he's too, unreliable.
As we spend time with Michael Zeldin, the former federal prosecutor, I wonder what you're looking for at this point, Michael. We're going to have another gag order hearing for further alleged violations, other complaints on Thursday. But what testimony are you compelled by right now? We're waiting for Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, the star witnesses. Hope Hicks could be a closer from what we're hearing. But we've got 6 weeks to fill. What will be important?
Well, we'll see whether this lasts 6 weeks. But I was interested in what happened in the courtroom today with Davidson, the lawyer for Stormy Daniels, because he didn't really give direct testimony that Donald Cohen was going to be the payor of this $130,000 hush money payment. He said, I assumed it. That's been the ordinary course. The defense objected to speculation, and the judge sustained that objection, that he couldn't speculate. So I think, the defense here is not likely shooting for an absolute not guilty verdict, but rather a hung jury, a one-person, two-person not guilty and the rest guilty, and therefore they have to retry it. And I think Davidson really didn't do the job that the prosecutors hoped he would do by saying, I knew Donald Trump was going to pay this money. In fact, he said Trump was just dragging his feet, and then Michael Cohen jumps in. Well, if you're a defense attorney, you can argue, well, Donald Trump had second thoughts about paying this, and that undermines the notion that there was an imperative for the election. And Cohen, wanting to be, Superman and savior and gets the pat on the head, decides to jump in on his own. So I think there's a lot in today's testimony that the defense will probably be happy about when it comes to their closing argument about reasonable doubt.
That's a really interesting reading, considering we also did hear Davidson kind of suggest it wasn't clear to him whether or not Cohen had the authority to make the payment without Donald Trump's say-so, which kind of brings it back to this question around whether this actually was a Class E felony, that it was falsifying business records with the intent to violate election law to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. Is what really has to be proven here intent, that all of this really was about politics? Is that essentially what you're saying the difficulty might be for prosecutors when hearing testimony like we heard today?
Well, their theory of prosecution seems to be that there was a payment made to Stormy Daniels because it was necessary to suppress in order to prevent the story from interfering with his electoral aspirations. Then the second part is they covered that up on the business records and falsified those business records. So the primary charge is falsification of business records with the intent to, they say, interfere with the election, but it also could be intent to interfere with tax charges, because that is alleged here too. But they've hung their hat so far mostly on election interference. And all I'm saying is, so far as of today, I don't think they've clearly established that Trump was the payor and knew he was going to make the payment. I think there are inferences that can be drawn, but I think they need to tighten up their testimony.
All right, Michael Zeldin, former federal prosecutor. It's always great to have you on the show, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Now we turn to something that's dominating not domestic political intrigue, but geopolitics, with the situation in the Middle East and the war between Israel and Hamas. It's something we heard about from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, earlier today. I believe you can take a listen to what the secretary said.
Our focus right now is on getting a ceasefire and hostages home. That is the most urgent thing. And it's also, I think, what is achievable because the Israelis have put a strong proposal on the table. They've demonstrated that they're willing to compromise. And now it's on Hamas.
For more, let's bring in now Brett Bruen, president of the Global Situation Room and a former U.S. diplomat in the Obama administration. Brett, thank you so much for joining us here on Balance of Power. We've seen Secretary Blinken in the region many times since October 7th, and we have seen him oftentimes pushing for a ceasefire deal, the one it seems we may be getting closer to reaching now. And yet often the secretary has returned from the Middle East with little to show for his effort. Is this time going to be different?
Well, I think in diplomatic terms, Kayleigh, we are within striking distance of the end zone. The question, though, is, as a recovering diplomat, you know that those last few yards are the most difficult. They're the most treacherous when it comes to the potential that Hamas, or for that matter, Israel or some other actor could throw a wrench into it. So you've got Secretary Blinken doing the old-fashioned shuttle diplomacy between capitals in the region, trying to find where common ground and pressure can be applied. I think that we will see, just because obviously folks in the White House so desperately need this ceasefire to take hold, both for global as well as obviously for domestic reasons. So I expect that we will see this in a matter of weeks, if not days.
Brett, it's good to see you. Welcome back. Let's not leave the negotiating table here for a moment. Yesterday, we spoke with Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. Here's what he had to say.
The one guy who is not in this picture right now, CIA Director Bill Burns, I would keep your eye on whether or not Bill Burns is going to travel. He's been a key component with respect to these negotiations over the last 4 months. I still think there's a reasonable chance that you can see a deal.
Brett, do they need the CIA director again at the table? And who else needs to be there to push this across the finish line?
You know, Joe, this is an interesting feature of Biden diplomacy because he appointed this veteran diplomat to the leadership at Langley. And Bill Burns, as Aaron says there, has played a role, not just in the Middle East, in China, in Russia. And in some ways, he comes equipped with those intelligence files, with the dirt on some of these folks involved and the ability to add additional pressure. So you are going to see a full diplomatic, intelligence, even defense push on this to try and box in both Hamas, our Arab allies, as well as the Israelis. I think the most difficult piece of this puzzle is Benjamin Netanyahu, who has proven once again today with his statements on Rafah that he is willing to throw caution to the wind.
Well, it's an excellent point on Benjamin Netanyahu, who also may be potentially, according to reports that we have seen, about to be hit with an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, along with other Israeli officials. The U.S. is pushing against that. Mike Johnson apparently spoke with the Secretary of State today to weigh in on the ICC issue. Brett, how serious is this? Do you think the ICC will back off this effort at the urging of the U.S. and other allies in the name of trying to protect a ceasefire deal?
Well, Kayleigh, I have to say it's not helpful, especially as we are trying to work out these negotiations. Understand that the South African case has been presented, and obviously there is a push by some countries, notably, obviously, in Africa, the Middle East, as well as some in Europe, who've said there have been war crimes, there is genocide being committed, and therefore steps need to be taken. But when we talk about what is it going to take to get to a ceasefire, to get to some sort of stability and security stabilization, the ICC is not going to play a role in that. They're going to play a role, if at all, in accountability and evidentiary steps going forward out of here. Let's also remember, Israel is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. They didn't sign the Rome Statute. Now, the Palestinian territories did, and that's where the ICC is saying they have jurisdiction here. Nonetheless, it'll complicate certainly Netanyahu and other Israeli officials' travel when they're going overseas, because countries where they travel to have an obligation, if there is that warrant, to take action.
Brett, the conventional wisdom here appears to be, as we continue to hear on this program, that Israel is eyeing a new front to the north, that in fact will engage Hezbollah at some point in Lebanon. In that scenario, if you believe that happens, is a ceasefire durable, never mind normalization with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I would say, one, Israel would see these as separate issues. That is, they don't currently have ceasefire negotiations with Hezbollah. So the ceasefire would apply to Hamas, to the Gaza territory only. Obviously, you have an element of Iran involved with both Hamas and Hezbollah. So there is a level of complication there. However, obviously, in what we've seen transpire over the last few weeks with the exchange of missiles, the exchange of attacks between Tehran and Jerusalem, there is, I think, a delicate balance at the moment, and one that I would be surprised if Netanyahu wants to disrupt unless there is a clear and imminent threat that is posed by Hezbollah. But he has shown no concern or caution in taking steps, including, obviously, throughout the Gaza territory when he deems it in the interest of Israel.
Brett, it's great to have you back with us. So the Global Situation Room here in the nation's capital. Brett Bruen, we thank you. Coming up, Democrats say they'll swoop in to save the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, from a possible GOP ouster. Is this the coalition government? We'll be joined by our political panel next to talk about this more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Was laser focused on getting the supplemental done. Now, I've had colleagues from both parties come up to me on the floor, of course, and say, we won't stand for this. We're not going to shut the government down and all that, shut the House down. And, of course, I've acknowledged that. But I've not requested assistance from anyone. I've not focused on that at all. I've focused on getting the job done and getting the legislation passed. And that's what. No, there's no deals at all.
A newly protected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, talking earlier after the Democratic leadership made clear that, yes, Democrats in the House will be there to protect him if a move to oust him from his speakership is followed up on by the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene and others. Joining us now, our political panel. Sarah Chamberlain is here, Republican Main Street Partnership CEO, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner. Sarah, I'm not sure you knew this was coming, but I'm guessing you did. And I'm wondering what this means for Hakeem Jeffries. It's different when rank-and-file Democrats tell us here on Balance of Power, sure, I'll protect Mike Johnson. But this was kind of the party speaking, the leadership weighing in today, Catherine Clark and others. So this is a formal situation now. Did they talk this out with Mike Johnson, or were they actually poking Mike Johnson at this moment when the motion to vacate was starting to fade out a little bit?
Well, at this point, 6 months before an election, they can't afford to have the speakership vacated. Biden is running for re-election, so they probably talked to President Biden and said, listen, we need to cut a deal here.
Democrats cannot afford it?
Joe Biden cannot afford to have the unrest in the House because nothing more will get done. We have FAA. We've got a few bills left to pass. I mean, we did some great things a couple weeks ago, but we've got more to do. And Joe Biden can't seem to appear to have a dysfunctional Washington.
Okay, so that's Sarah's take. I wonder your view on this, Kristen. The idea that the Democrats have said, yes, we will vote to table this particular motion. What if Marjorie Taylor Greene tries again and again and again? Theoretically, there's nothing stopping her. Should Democrats keep showing up, or do they only show up once?
They will. It's a procedural motion, but let's be clear. The Democrats also believe that the Speaker showed up and did the right thing on foreign aid, and that there's a lot of goodwill there because of that. So, I think it says a lot about how we're operating in the House. And a lot of people would say, like, the Speaker can't get anything done without Democratic votes. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But, it just goes to show that when we're going to get anything, done in the House that's of any significance, that the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, under his leadership, are going to come to the table and provide a governing body.
We'll leave it to me to be conspiratorial here, but I just wonder, there's no idea that Democratic leaders, that Hakeem Jeffries might be needling Mike Johnson a little bit, knowing that their endorsement weakens him with his own conference. Does this make it impossible for him to be reelected as a Republican speaker, having been bailed out by Democrats? Marjorie Taylor Greene's already called him the Democrat speaker.
So it potentially does. It depends on what happens in the elections. Do we pick up more seats? Do we have a larger control of the House, or do we lose the House? If we have a larger control of the House, I think he's fine. I think he would be reelected. If you have more Main Street conservatives in there, they would vote for the Speaker.
So it depends on November.
Depends on the numbers. It really is going to come down to a numbers game, what happens in November. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's still more than 6 months between now and November.
Lifetime.
And to what you were referencing earlier, Sarah, there is still more work to do, which is maybe why no one other than Marjorie Taylor Greene and maybe a few select others would like to see another weeks-long speaker battle, Kristen. But when we think about the work that may be ahead, Sarah mentioned the FAA authorization, which seems like there may be a bunch of things added to it that could make it a little bit more difficult to get across the finish line in time for a deadline. Is it going to be as easy to get work done going forward if Democrats and Mike Johnson have come to this kind of agreement? You scratch our backs or do the good thing in our eyes, we will keep you protected? Or does that only really work for this specific thing and all the other battles are still going to be just as hard to fight?
Well, I mean, I would listen to Sarah on the Republican end of things, but I think that there is maybe a threshold that's been crossed. when the speaker has realized that with such a thin majority, he can't do anything without the Democrats. And with the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, and the speaker have a talking relationship. They work together. They bring people to the table. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I think that if, he can ignore the more fringe elements of his party, meaning the speaker, then actually some things can get done.
You mentioned the FAA, Sarah. This could be the last train leaving the station, we're told, and so everybody wants to hitch a ride. To the extent that this becomes the Christmas tree that everybody's talking about here, what does Main Street want to see added to the legislation?
They want to see the Farm Bill passed, too. Okay. So I would say there's two key pieces of legislation they want to get done. And they don't want to add things. They don't want this to become a Christmas tree. They want it to be good legislation for the American people that they can go home and run on.
So is that's number one, is the Farm Bill? Are we going to hear more talk about that?
The Farm Bill are the two biggest ones you're going to try to see.
How about amendments, though, added to the FAA?
The
not going to happen?
Maybe. I mean, there's still a lot of discussion around that, to be honest. Yeah. But the Republican Main Street Partnership members really do not want everything thrown into this. I mean, they have to go home and talk about this and run on this, and they need to explain to the American people what they're passing in Washington.
Well, something that they may well pass, if you listen to Mike Johnson and other leaders in the House today, Kristen, was this idea that you are going to see congressional action against anti-Semitism aimed at protecting Jewish students on college campuses, as we see what's happening at Columbia University and across the country. How consequential politically is that? Is that really just messaging at a time where it's an opportunity to potentially really paint the picture of division within the Democratic Party and an issue for President Biden?
I mean, I think it's very consequential politically. I mean, you're looking at all these college campuses. People are coming together. You have to address something like this. I mean, it's gaining momentum. But it's a bigger conversation, and there's a lot of nuance there, which sometimes isn't acknowledged when you're talking about the protests that are going on at various universities all across the country. But, the president's going to have to deal with it. He is dealing with it right now. And, coming up on November, there's got to be some resolution, if not, just acknowledging what's happening, dealing with both sides of the issue, which is not easy to do.
All right, Kristen Hahn and Sarah Chamberlain are going to be sticking with us because while President Biden is dealing with this issue, former President Trump is getting ready to make campaign stops in Wisconsin and Michigan tomorrow. It's his day off from court in New York. We'll have more with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm supposed to be in Georgia. I'm supposed to be in New Hampshire. I'm supposed to be in Ohio and lots of other places. And they have me sitting here.
That was former President Donald Trump leaving court in New York earlier today. Our political panel is back with us. Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership CEO, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner. Kristen, you're in New York right now, and it was in New York this morning when the judge in this hush money case slapped Trump with $9,000 in fines for 9 counts of violating a gag order and threatened him potentially with incarceration if he continues to violate it. We've heard a lot that perhaps that's something we're not actually going to see, but wouldn't that also be politically problematic when Trump has convinced a lot of his followers that this is Joe Biden that is leading the charge here? And if he actually goes to jail, what does that actually do to his chances of winning re-election in November?
I mean, I don't think he will. He definitely, it almost looks like he's trying to goat the court into putting him in jail. I think that would just play right into his hands. He, his supporters are watching him every single day. And I love that he's saying, I should be in Iowa. They're keeping me here. They're not keeping him here. He did something that's keeping him there. There's a reason why he can't be in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Iowa and all the places he wants to be.
Well, all the while, Republicans in Washington are watching and listening. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican, of course, from New York, has filed an ethics complaint to the DOJ to open an investigation into a different case, Special Counsel Jack Smith. Listen.
Democrats' corrupt and desperate witch hunts against President Trump must come to an end. This is lawfare and blatant election interference, and the American people know it. That is why today I filed an official complaint with the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility on Joe Biden's special counsel Jack Smith for his clear and illegal efforts of election interference.
So there's an official act in response to Donald Trump's legal saga, but it's in the air. It's in the conversation every day. How is it impacting work or even just the functioning of the Republican conference in the House?
It's not really affecting it. I mean, she did this. I know Elise well. She's a very nice woman, but she's also trying to become the vice president of the United States. So she did it. She's not the only one. So she did this, and she has every right to do this, but I don't think that's going to get a lot of traction within the House.
Okay, well, in order for her to become vice president, Trump would have to win in November. And, of course, she would have to win the Veep stakes, which are still ongoing. There seems like there's many players who are on that list that might not be so short. But I would like to get your reaction to what Kristen just said, which essentially indicating that maybe Trump is actually trying to go with the judge into sending him to jail because that would only work better for him. Do you agree with that?
100% agree with that. And I think that's why the judge isn't doing it. I think he's afraid to fall into that trap. Okay, the MAGA Republicans love Donald Trump. When he said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, he probably could. If they put him in jail, he'll raise a lot of money, and I think his base will be energized even more and be sure to turn out in November. So you have to find him in this situation.
It's interesting, though, Kristen, what we just heard from Donald Trump is what we've been hearing every day in court. He comes out there, the reporters are waiting for him. You can hardly hear what he's saying. He talks about how he should be in North Carolina or Ohio. I know that consistency and repetition is important in political messaging, but at what point does this just get old?
I think that's yet to be seen. I mean, we've called him Teflon Don for a really long time, and so this hasn't really helped it. But I think, headed into the general election, when you're looking at those voters who are going to decide who wins the election, the ones in the middle, the independents, the center-left, the center-right, I think that they're going to get tired of this. And as President Biden continues to take the fight to Donald Trump more and more, then, the election's going to sway in his favor. People are just going to be tired of this.
Just quickly, Kristen, Biden was in Wilmington, Delaware today campaigning. Tomorrow, Donald Trump's going to Michigan and Wisconsin, swing states. Should Biden be anywhere other than swing states right now?
I mean, Biden's everywhere. And I think, look, he went to Florida. It's not that the Democrats are going to win Florida. We're not. But he's highlighting one of the big issues that we have to deal with, which is, women's health care. Right to abortion. And he's highlighting that issue in a state that has an antiquated law that's going to hurt a lot of women but the whole country's seeing it.
Kristen Hahn, great to have you back, Kristen. And Sarah Chamberlain, our great panel today. Thank you both for your thoughts and analysis. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And come back to see us tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.